But I want to tell you a story about one of the craziest, most dangerous things that I ever did in my life. And it has to do with my wife. So, as some of you know, we just last week celebrated 30 years of marriage. 30 years. And so the story I'm going to tell you is actually about how we met 35 years ago, right around this time, how it all started. It was 1988, and I was an American student at Oxford University. And I will tell you, I'll admit this now, it's very embarrassing actually. I was living out a less exciting version of Oxford Blues from 1984. The movie came out a few years before, and I loved Oxford before that, but that movie, just to think that I was inspired by Rob Lowe is kind of a little embarrassing right now. But you remember that movie if you're my age or roughly a little older, you'll remember that movie. You didn't think you'd come to High Holidays and hear about Oxford Blues, right? But yeah, Julian Sands was in that movie. Blessed memory. He was the rival in that. But thinking about an American who comes to England and proceeds to make a fool of himself was definitely part of the script. Because I met Tracy not long after I got there, and let's just say I didn't make a great first impression or second impression. I behaved like an American and did the things that people normally do to impress women in America, and everything I did was had the opposite effect. It was just really bad, and I started off really, really poor, and I had to work my way up. And so the next months, I did everything I could. I went every Shabbat to the Oxford Jewish Society. Doesn't that sound very posh? That's their Hillel. It's called the Oxford Jewish Society. And so I went every Shabbat to their Shabbat dinner, and it was great. It's amazing. It was all student-led, and I went there every Shabbat. And then I realized that I would have to do more, and I was running out of time. So I needed to do something pretty drastic, pretty dramatic. So she had a friend who was at Oxford. We had a mutual friend who was a neighbor of hers, and he was in charge of the Oxford Center for the struggle for Soviet Jewry, the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. And so this was still the late 80s, and that was still something that we were advocating for in the West. And so I got active in the organization, and then I signed up for a summer trip to go to Russia and Ukraine. This was an era of glasnost and perestroika, and things were starting to open up, and there were Jews that were finally able to go, but there were still many Jews that were being denied visas, especially people who had security issues. And so the project involved booking a trip to the Soviet Union through Intourist, which was the Soviet-run tourist agency, the only way you could go visit the country. So you would book the tour, and then we met with the people in England who ran the program, and we were set up. We had to have appointments and meetings with Soviet Jews, refuseniks in the Jewish community. We would set up in the evening, so we'd tour during the day, and then in the evening we would do these meetings. And at the time, it was illegal even to go out of the hotel or go off the tour on your own. And the Soviets were committed to making sure that any tourism that was going on was going to be under their complete control. And every tourist was under constant supervision by the KGB. But being able to go on this trip allowed me to go back to England in August. I got to have another visit, got to visit with Tracy. And then we went from there from England on to the Soviet Union. So we had all of the names of the contacts that we were going to be meeting with. We had to put them in code so that in case our stuff got searched, they wouldn't know who we were meeting with. And we brought items for them, things that we packed for them. So a lot of our bags were actually stuff for them: clothing, food products, some kosher salamis, and things like that. The most expensive items we took were some radios and some electronics. All of these things most of our stuff was for other people. And we knew that if we were caught, we would have definitely been arrested, and we could could possibly have been jailed. But in the first few days, I realized that the Soviet Union was done. The tour guides who accompanied us were all employed by the KGB, and they couldn't care less what we were doing. And they knew that KGB was watching us. They would call our room, make sure we were there, just hang up, but they made no effort to intervene, nothing. It was apparent that the KGB could care less about the tour. And my tour guide, one of these these young KGB guys, he actually traded me his hat and uniform. I have this whole uniform that I traded for some Levi's. So it was pretty clear that he didn't care, because he could have been arrested for giving me his uniform. I mean, probably a couple years before. And it was an eye-opening experience, because I realized that the country had completely fallen apart. And it was tragic, because I saw veterans from World War II. They would come out in their uniforms and with their medals on their jackets, and they were waiting in line for food, for basic food items. And the real reason why the Soviets didn't want us to deviate off the tours was because they didn't want people to see how bad it was, what was really happening. And citizens there were doing everything they could to scrape together a few extra rubles. Some of them were showing movies in their apartments at the time. This was back in the VCR days. And they would get a video from a friend or relative, would smuggle in a video, and then they would show the movie in their apartment. And it was weird, because it was 1989, and the most popular movie was Rambo 3, which was Rambo killing Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan. And people were waiting down, you'd see them in the halls waiting to go into someone's apartment for a movie. And in Kiev, where we spent a few days, people had pooled their money together to buy Geiger counters so that they could measure radioactivity, because this was just a couple of years after Chernobyl. And no one believed the government that there was radioactive material. It wasn't there anymore, that it wasn't in the food. That, needless to say, we didn't have any milk or any dairy products when we were in Kiev, but the government was telling them it was all safe, and they knew it wasn't, and that's why they had these Geiger counters that they would buy themselves. But here was the kicker. I came back from the trip and met with the people back in England, and I told them, when they debriefed me, I said, you better figure this out, because this country's falling apart, and I know a lot of Jews are going to get out. They're going to go to Israel. God willing, they'll find safety in Israel or in the United States or in Europe, but not everyone's going to leave. And you better figure out what you're going to do. And you better figure it out fast, because by the time I was there in '89, the Jews for Jesus folks were already there. They were already going to the Jewish community and trying to tell them about Messianic Judaism. This is a book that I took from the library at the Jewish club there in Kiev, which was a Messianic tract translated into Russian. But I was in Ukraine for about 10 days. And the most powerful time I had in Ukraine on that whole trip, one of the most powerful moments in my life, was one of the extra excursions that I took on my own. Not to meet with anybody in particular, not a person, but we took a streetcar to just outside of Kiev to a place called Babi Yar. And in one weekend in 1941, in September, over 30,000 Jews were murdered there. In just one weekend. And throughout the war, there's an estimate of maybe 150,000 or more people that were murdered and buried in this place. And it looks like a park. You have no idea where you are when you get off. And at the time, there was one monument in Cyrillic that didn't even mention the Jews. And for a while, there was no monument at all. Now there's a big menorah, but the murders at Babi Yar were committed primarily by the SS and the Wehrmacht, but it was also Ukrainians as well. And the Jews that I visited in Ukraine in 1989 told me that they were gone as soon as Ukraine was independent. Once the Ukrainians had power again, they're out. Once they started teaching Ukrainian in the schools, we're out of here. And given the history of Jews in Ukraine, how could they have imagined any different? Look, the national hero of Ukraine, the George Washington of Ukraine, is a man named Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And before there was Hitler, there was Khmelnytsky. He led the Cossack armies in the 1600s that were responsible for maybe upwards of 1 million Jews that were murdered in that area of Poland and Ukraine. And the psychological trauma of the Khmelnytsky pogroms were with us for hundreds of years. It's why, as I mentioned last night, Golda Meir remembers hiding in Kiev where she lived as a kid. It's why Tevye and the family have to worry about the pogroms and why they finally leave. It's why most of us are here today in the United States, because our families left that area. And here in Ukraine, Khmelnytsky was a national hero, and you'd go to the city square and you'd see a statue of Khmelnytsky. That's a fact. You'd see that, and as a Jew, how do you process that this man, who is a hero to the Ukrainians because he led one of their moves towards independence and national identity, how do you process that? And so you can understand why this is a part of history, and it's why the New York Times has run a few articles about the Nazi symbols and the anti-Semitism, the symbolic, especially when it comes to symbols that the Ukrainian army currently uses. And it's why you could have something like Putin now telling people that he's there to denazify the Ukraine currently. But that's a lie. And that's not what happened. And it's not the way Ukraine has functioned for the last 30 years, independent of the Soviet Union. There is rampant corruption and serious problems with the way Ukraine has functioned since its independence. But it's a move towards NATO in the West that will only accelerate its acceptance of democracy and freedom. Is there anti-Semitism there now? Absolutely. And you know what? There is here too. And guess what they have that we don't? A Jewish president. Zelensky. He's a national hero. He's a worldwide hero. He's a great symbol for Jewish men everywhere, for Jewish people everywhere. And it's not just Zelensky. The defense minister until 2 weeks ago, Oleg Reznikov, was also part of the leadership, is also Jewish. But I want you to understand something. This isn't my opinion. I don't want to tell you what you hear or what you should read. It's better you don't take my word for it anyways. I want to bring up two people to help share what they've seen. Igor and Elena Yasno. They were born and raised in Kiev, the capital. They immigrated to the United States in the late 70s, and they got out like a lot of our people. They married and raised two sons here in America. They founded a software company in the 80s, and they've paid very close attention to what's happened in Ukraine in these last days. They went back in May of this year and spent a month in country working with volunteers who had to take cover in bomb shelters. And they're here today as another surprise. Igor and Elena, if you'd come up.
Good morning. Shana Tova, and happy 5784 to everyone. We have a lot of hopes for the new year, and one of the biggest ones is our hope for victory. And we can talk about it later if you wish. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank Rabbi Mark for including us in this service. And this is going to be a tough act to follow with the Tevye, the milkman, And the memory lane trip with the Rabbi, those were the times, weren't they? We are Elena and Igor Yasno. Our original name was Yasnogorodsky. Why? Because we come from a shtetl called Yasnogorodka, not far from the shtetl where Tevye was from, and Shalom Aleichem. We were born in Kyiv, Ukraine, not far from the house where Golda Meir was born. There are lots and lots of Jewish leaders and famous men, including Sikorsky, the inventor of the helicopter, who was born in Kyiv as well. So we come from a long line of Ukrainian Jews, and we're proud to call ourselves Ukrainian Jews, even though it is a long and complicated history, as you just heard from the Rabbi. Yes, we just came back from Ukraine. We've been working with the local volunteers. We took money, we took medicine, we took some other supplies, and we spent about a month in Ukraine. During the day, we were working with the volunteers, visiting different remote villages, helping people, delivering humanitarian aid, and at night we were running for the bomb shelters. This is no joke. We were bombarded with everything. The Iranian kamikaze drones, ballistic missiles, and everything in between. Luckily, next to our apartment building where we rented a place, there was a metro station, and we would go there and sit there from 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning until the all clear signal was given. And we were surrounded by people with children and dogs and cats and everything they took with them because it was just dangerous to be at home. So this was the most difficult and inspiring trip for us, and we will tell you a little bit more about it later. But so we have lots and lots of stories to tell, but don't worry, we're not going to tell you all those stories today, right now. There's just not enough time to do all that. We're working on a documentary film which is in the pre-release stage right now that will explain some of these things that happened to us. But as Soviet Jews or ex-Soviet Jews, we are very much interested in the Jewish life and in Jewish history of Ukraine. So during our trip, we were making a point of meeting with the Jews that never left the country. And the Rabbi is absolutely correct. About 2 million Soviet Jews did leave, and here we are today. But about 250,000 didn't. And they still live there. And we wanted to meet with them and figure out what is it like for a Jew to live in Ukraine right now, as we speak. And it is also a very interesting story. One of the most important meetings was with a rabbi called David, and he's a military chaplain in the Ukrainian Defense Force. One among 60 chaplains. It's a brand new branch of the armed forces right now. And he's serving about 1 million men that require help, because these men very often gravely wounded. He needs to give them the last rites. He needs to accompany their bodies back to the family and bury them. And I asked him one question: David, what is it like for a Jewish rabbi to give last rites to an Orthodox Christian or to a Muslim soldier? And he looked at me very sadly and he said, Igor, at that time it really doesn't matter. This was the most profound, interesting, and uplifting interview we've ever conducted. And I'm forever thankful to Rabbi David for that meeting. He gave me his patch a shoulder patch. Everybody, I forgot to bring it with me today. It's a patch that is worn by a special unit in the Ukrainian army, manned primarily by the Israelis. About 16 Israeli soldiers were killed in action in Israel during this war. I'm sorry, in Ukraine during this war. And he took this patch and gave it to me. And this is one of the most valuable things that I brought back from Ukraine. Perhaps one of these days, if we come back, or when we come back, I'd like to show it to you and share it with you. Very, very interesting thing. Last but not least, thank you for mentioning Babi Yar. Elena and I have lost great-grandparents there. We know what happened on September 29, 1941. We know who was responsible. We know a lot of things about it. And nevertheless, we find it in ourselves not only to know history, but worry about the present and the future. Having spoken to these Ukrainian Jews, I am very, very optimistic about their future in Ukraine and the future of their country. And one more thing. As we speak, about 40,000 Orthodox Jews have traveled to Ukraine today because they are visiting the holy grave of Rabbi Nachman in Uman, which is a tiny place between Kiev and Odessa, and it goes back to the 16th, 17th century, the story of that place, and also a fascinating story. So with that, I would like you to keep in mind that Ukraine has always played a very important and often tragic role in Jewish history. No denying that. It is complicated, as I like to tell the people who listen to me. It is complicated. We are tourist guides, by the way, but we don't work for the KGB, I have to tell you. And when people ask me to explain what happened, I would love to. It just takes a long time. Thank you.
And again, thank you very much. I'm extremely emotional right now. Sitting through the service, it really affected me. I am proud of saying I am Jewish. Although I grew up hiding it, I did not want to admit that I was Jewish. It was always something that I was trying not to recognize. And to be here and to be a part of this community was extremely emotional. But I want to explain how extremely wonderful it is to be here to address you about where we come from, what we bring with ourselves, how when we left the Soviet Union, we did not want to even think about going back. But then when the Soviet Union fell apart, we started going back, and we noticed what a huge difference this country is. And the more we go, the more we see how much they accomplish, how much better they become, what a difference it is. Nobody knows who's who anymore. It's not written in your passport that you're Jewish. It doesn't exist anymore. People don't know who is who. And that's important because everybody is basically the same. It's equal. And you are not prosecuted if you want to practice religion. And when we came back from Ukraine, we were so overwhelmed with everything we saw and felt, all the emotions, all the experiences. I cried my eyes out the whole month and after. We wanted to do something. We didn't know exactly how to approach this. And having the opportunity to speak to people, to see you, to tell you our story of what we have been through, what we saw, how we feel about Ukraine right now, how proud we are of being Jewish Ukrainian, Ukrainian Jewish American, American Jewish Ukrainian. we are who we are. And that's why we want to ask for your help. Help us help Ukraine. Because as we speak, every single day, the Russians are destroying this country. They are bombarding. Every single day, there are people dying. Every single day, there are children maimed. They blow themselves up on those minefields. It is absolutely heartbreaking. And I still get my messages every time there is an air raid alert, and my heart breaks. So we want to speak to as many people as we can. We want to deliver this message. Please help us help Ukraine. Do whatever it is you can do for us to organize speeches, to let us show the movie. We would love to screen our film. We have so many stories. And you know what? I was proud that the president of the Ukraine was congratulating on the main television channels with Rosh Hashanah, with 20 other rabbis from Ukraine. This has never happened before. And I'm so proud of him. So thank you for letting us say our words, and I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to do one more thing and to present Rabbi Mark with this gift from Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
And so the information about their organization, which is called Ukraine, with Y-O-U, Ukraine Now, the information is out there. We are going to have a screening of the movie. Our friend Craig, our mutual friend Craig, is putting the final touches on it, I know, and it'll be ready soon. And so it does fall on our community and our country to continue to stand with Ukraine. Again, it's ironic that the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who fled are now going back to help protect it. And it's one of the ironies of history. But listen, we would have done the same thing if Germany or some of the other countries of Europe had been invaded during that time in the 80s and 90s when we were growing up in the Cold War. And we thought it could happen. And you know what? We would have gone over there and protected those countries. That's what we do. And over the course of this next year, you're going to hear a lot about this discussion of support of Ukraine and our country. You're going to see it as part of the presidential debates and national discussions. And there's inevitably going to be fatigue in the support of Ukraine. It's going to happen. But this catastrophe cannot be allowed to continue in silence. And there needs to be accountability, of course, for the funds that we spend as Americans. There needs to be transparency. But this war must end with Ukraine remaining free and independent and Russia being held accountable. This may well be the inflection point for our generation. I know there are fears that this is going to lead to World War III or that it's already part of World War III, but there's also a very real possibility that the only way we stop dictatorships and further bloodshed and from destroying a relative peace that we've enjoyed since 1945. Most of us don't understand that we grew up in a world that was much safer than our parents and grandparents. And the only way to stop this clamping down of liberalization that's been going on, we've seen it in countries like Russia and China and India where people are watching their freedoms being taken away. The only way is by standing firm right now. We've all watched as Putin has now for a generation been taking away the freedom of his people, killing anyone who gets in his way, and every time he's been given an inch, he's taken a mile. And we learned at Babi Yar what appeasement leads to. So we're going to screen this movie, and we're also now going to hear another surprise, which is between this Rosh Hashanah and the next one, probably sometime in the spring, I'll be going with these people to Ukraine. Look at my wife's face. So it'll probably be in about May. But God willing, I won't have to go. I hope that the war is over by then. Yeah, and I'm not doing it to impress my wife. Quite the opposite. She's gonna be upset. But and this is the crazy stuff that she has to put up with. But she's long ago given up trying to figure me out. I've given up trying to figure me out. So this is not for her. This is for me and for my kids and, God willing, my grandkids and great-grandkids, because I want them to know that I did something at this time. And I'm asking you again, if it isn't going to be Ukraine, there's wars going on in other places in Ethiopia, there's floods in North Africa right now, there's homelessness at a level you've never seen in our own community. Whatever it is, helping seniors, helping to fight disease, do something, pick something. Let's all do something to alleviate suffering, to make this world a better place. Some of you are going to leave here and go, the rabbi talked about how he met his wife. He talked about Ukraine. He talked about Oxford blues. But if you hear one thing, understand that this moment right now, what we're doing right now, is praying and hoping that we'll be in the book of life, that God will give us one more year. And we ask God to give us this year so that we do something, that we make a difference. This year, Lord, give us the strength and the wisdom to know what it is we're going to do, and the strength and the conviction to carry it out. Good Yontif, good Yor, Shana Tova.